The invitation was made as a joke on a Tuesday evening, and everyone at the table laughed except the man it was made in front of. "Bring the counting maid to dinner on Thursday," said Mr. Bethany, setting down his glass with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself clever. "The one who caught the fish merchant shortchanging the kitchen. Let her sit among us and tell us what we owe for the silver too." It was meant to wound, and it did, though not in the direction anyone in that room expected. Duke Nathan Khan did not laugh. He did not object either. He looked into his wine for a long moment and said nothing at all, and by Wednesday morning 9 guests believed they had been promised an amusement for Thursday night. What walked through the dining room doors on Thursday evening was a young woman in deep burgundy silk stitched through with gold thread, and 3 people at that table recognized the gown before she had taken her hand off the door. Before the story goes any further, tell me in the comments which country you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are right now. I read every single comment myself, and if a story like this is the kind that keeps you company, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means more than you would think to a storyteller, knowing someone is listening on the other side of the world. Duke Khan's estate, called Hollingbourne, had 40 rooms, and Scarlett Greenwood had cleaned nearly all of them at one point or another. She had come into service 5 years earlier, at 18, after her mother's illness had eaten through whatever savings her father, a village bookkeeper, had left behind when a sudden fever took him. She had grown up watching him balance ledgers by lamplight at the kitchen table, humming under his breath whenever a column finally agreed with itself, and something of his patience for numbers had settled into her the way a habit settles into a hand and never quite leaves it. She was not supposed to notice anything beyond her work. A housemaid folding linens in the hallway is not expected to glance at a delivery note left open on the side table and see, in 4 seconds, that the wine merchant had charged for 11 cases and delivered 9. She was not expected to remember it 3 weeks later when the same merchant's invoice arrived again, carrying the same quiet, careless difference. But Scarlett Greenwood remembered every number that ever crossed in front of her, the way some people remember faces or songs, and she had begun, without asking anyone's permission, keeping a small record of her own in a plain notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself, more than once, that a maid who asks too many questions about money does not stay employed for long, and that curiosity was a luxury meant for people who did not need their wages to survive the winter. But she kept writing the numbers down anyway, because some part of her simply could not stand watching a wrong sum sit there unspoken, the way another person could not stand a crooked picture on a wall. Duke Nathan Khan had not always been a quiet man. Mrs. Dale, the housekeeper who had served the family for 20 years, remembered a version of him who laughed loudly at his own jokes and danced badly on purpose just to make his wife smile at dinner parties she had insisted on throwing. That man had begun disappearing 2 years earlier. On the cold morning Lady Sophia Hutchinson was found still and pale in the garden she had loved, her heart simply stopping in a way no physician in 3 counties could fully explain. Since then, Nathan Khan ran his estate the way a man runs a machine he no longer feels anything for, correctly, joylessly, and always at a careful distance from everyone living inside it, including himself. Subscribe so you don't miss where these stories go next, and drop a comment telling me which city or country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I would genuinely love to say hello to you personally, just to know how far our story has traveled together. Mornings at Hollingbourne began before the sun did, and Scarlett liked them best that way, when the house still belonged to the servants and not yet to the family who owned it. She swept the east hallway in the gray half-light, past the long gallery of portraits that ended with Sophia Hutchinson's, a painting of a woman in red silk with a private, knowing smile, hung so that it caught the first sun of every morning before anyone else was awake to see it. "You look at her the same way every day," said Nora, a younger housemaid who had joined the household the previous spring and had quickly attached herself to Scarlett the way a younger sister attaches to an older one, half for guidance and half for company. "Like she is going to say something back to you eventually." "She never does," Scarlett said, "but I still say good morning to her. Someone should." Nora laughed, the easy laugh of a girl who had never once counted a coin twice to be sure of it. And the two of them went on with the morning's work. Grates cleared, fires laid, silver checked against the pantry list that Scarlett had, without telling anyone, begun quietly correcting for months because the old list had never once matched what was actually in the cupboard. It was during that same morning that Mrs. Dale found her in the small linen room, bent over a delivery slip with a pencil stub, her lips moving slightly the way they did whenever she was working through a column in her head. Mrs. Dale had learned, over the past year, to recognize that particular stillness in Scarlett and to leave her to it rather than interrupt. Something wrong with the linens? Mrs. Dale asked anyway, because curiosity was a housekeeper's oldest habit. Something wrong with the candles, Scarlett said, not looking up. We have been charged for 6 dozen 3 weeks running, and I would wager my next month's wages we have only ever received 5. Mrs. Dale said nothing for a moment, only studied the younger woman with an expression that was part fondness and part something closer to worry, the way one might look at a person standing too close to the edge of something they could not see. You have a gift, Scarlett Greenwood, she said finally. I only hope this house learns to value it before it decides to punish you for it instead. Later that day, Mr. Andrew, the butler, passed through the hall while Scarlett corrected a footman's sums on the fresh order for the coming week without being asked. The footman, a broad, cheerful young man named Noah who had never once in 3 years balanced his own wages without help, looked at the corrected page with open relief. You have saved me another scolding from Mr. Andrew, Noah said, grinning. At this rate, I shall have to start paying you in biscuits. I accept payment in biscuits, Scarlett said, and for a moment the whole kitchen passage smelled faintly of flour and good humor, a small, ordinary happiness that none of them yet knew was about to be tested. Mr. Andrew did not comment on the correction at the time. He only watched Scarlett a little longer than usual, filing the moment away the quiet, careful way he filed everything else that mattered in that house. It was on that same Tuesday, while sorting through the estate's charitable correspondence that Duke Nathan Khan rarely had the heart to open himself, that Scarlett found the entry that made her set down her cloth entirely. A payment, drawn from the late Duchess Sophia's charitable fund, made out to a name she did not recognize, for an amount too round and too generous to be honest. She copied it carefully into her notebook with a hand that was not quite steady, and folded the page shut without knowing yet that the numbers she was gathering, quietly, alone, night after night, would one day be laid across a dining table in front of every person about to laugh at her. If you have ever been underestimated by people who never once bothered to look closely at you, tell me in the comments. I want to hear that story too, and I promise I will reply to you personally. The guests began arriving at Hollingbourne on Thursday afternoon, their carriages catching the last gold light before evening settled properly over the grounds. Mr. Bethany was among the first through the door, already in high spirits, already reminding anyone within earshot that the household kept a maid who, in his words, added figures faster than most bankers in London. I only mean it kindly, he told Nathan, clapping him once on the shoulder as though the two of them shared a private joke that Nathan had never actually agreed to. A little entertainment for the table. Nothing more. Nathan said only, she has been asked. She will come, and turned away before Mr. Bethany could see how little the idea pleased him, though the truth was more complicated than pleasure or displeasure. He had simply not found, in 2 years, the energy required to fight battles that felt small compared to the one he had already lost, and so he let the invitation stand rather than spend himself defending a maid he had, until that week, barely noticed at all. A guest named Wyatt, young and eager to be thought clever in front of the older men at the table, leaned toward Jasmine, who had arrived with her aunt for the season and was still learning which jokes in this house landed and which ones did not. I do hope she brings her little book, Wyatt said, grinning. We could all use an audit of our characters, could we not? Jasmine laughed politely, the way a guest laughs at a joke made by a host's friend, though something in her stomach turned uneasily at the idea of a young woman being paraded in front of strangers for sport. She said nothing, because saying something felt, at 20, like more courage than she yet possessed, though she promised herself quietly that she would at least be kind to the maid when the moment came, whatever anyone else chose to do. Below stairs, Scarlett heard enough of the arrangement secondhand, through Nora's breathless retelling in the kitchen passage, to understand exactly what kind of evening she had been summoned to. They mean to make a fool of you. Nora said, wringing her apron in both hands. You should refuse it, Scarlett. Tell Mrs. Dale you are ill. If I refuse, they will say I was afraid, Scarlett answered, more calmly than she felt. If I go and say nothing, they will say I was dull. There is only one answer left that does not give them what they want. And what is that? I go, and I am neither afraid nor dull, Scarlett said, tying her apron back into place with hands that betrayed only the faintest tremor. I go, and I let them be wrong about me in front of everyone. Mrs. John, passing through with a tray of polished glasses, paused long enough to add, in her usual sparing way, wrong about you is the best thing a person like that can be. Let them learn it the slow way. It teaches better than any lecture ever could. It was Mrs. Dale who found Scarlett an hour before the dinner bell, standing in the corridor outside the small storage room that had not been opened since Sophia's death. There is something I need you to see before you go down tonight, the housekeeper said, and there was a weight in her voice that made Scarlett follow without asking a single question. The storage room smelled of cedar and old lavender, and the single gown hanging alone against the far wall caught what little window light remained, burgundy silk deep as wine, gold embroidery running down the bodice like a river that had found its own careful path years before Scarlett was ever born into this house. I cannot wear that, Scarlett said immediately, taking a step back rather than forward. Mrs. Dale, that is Lady Sophia's. I am aware of exactly whose it is, Mrs. Dale said, folding her hands the way she did when a decision had already settled itself firmly in her own mind and would not be moved. She wore it on the last evening she truly enjoyed herself in that dining room, before she fell ill. I have kept it clean and pressed for 2 years without ever knowing why I bothered. Perhaps tonight is the reason. His Grace will see me in it and think of her, Scarlett said quietly. I do not want to be the cause of that kind of pain. His Grace has thought of nothing but her for 2 years regardless of what you wear, Mrs. Dale answered, gentler now. The question is not whether you remind him of Sophia tonight. The question is whether you walk into that room as the joke they have already decided to make you, or as something they were not prepared for. Scarlett reached out and touched the sleeve, and beneath the softness of the silk her fingers caught on something stiffer than lining ought to be, a slight ridge running along the seam near the waist that felt deliberate rather than accidental. She said nothing about it yet, because there was no time left before the dinner bell, and because some instinct in her did not trust her own voice not to shake if she looked too closely at what her fingers had just found. She let Mrs. Dale help her into the gown. It fit her the way a key fits a lock it was never cut for, and somehow opens anyway, close enough at the shoulders and waist that both women stood in silence for a moment afterward, neither quite willing to say aloud how strange that felt. You look like her, Nora whispered from the doorway, where she had crept up unnoticed. Not her face, just something, the way she stood in the portrait. I am not trying to look like anyone, Scarlett said, smoothing the skirt with hands that had scrubbed floors and counted coins and now, for one evening, would hold a duchess's silk instead. I am only trying to walk into that room without giving them the satisfaction of watching me shrink. Mrs. Dale studied her for a long moment, eyes bright, and reached up to tuck one final pin into Scarlett's hair. Then hold your chin exactly as high as you are holding it now, she said, and let them stare as long as they like. Staring never hurt anyone who refused to be ashamed. The dining room glittered with candlelight and quiet anticipation as the guests took their seats, and Mr. Bethany, seated near the head of the table, kept glancing toward the door with the eager expression of a man expecting his own entertainment to arrive on schedule. The doors opened at 8 o'clock precisely, and every conversation in that room stopped at once, the way a candle stops flickering the instant a window is shut. A woman stood in the doorway in Sophia Hutchinson's gown, her hand still resting lightly on the handle, and for 3 full seconds nobody breathed. Mrs. Dale, standing near the sideboard where she had positioned herself deliberately, watched Nathan's face move from confusion to something far older and heavier than confusion, something that looked, for one unguarded instant, like grief walking back into the room on its own 2 feet. Mr. Bethany's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Jasmine's hand rose without her meaning it to, pressing lightly against her own collarbone. Kira, seated near the far end beside her brother Leo, leaned close and whispered something neither of them could later remember, because whatever it was, It did not matter beside what they were both looking at. Nathan rose from his chair without deciding to. "Where?" he said, and could not finish the sentence, the single word hanging in the candlelight like something too fragile to complete. "Mrs. Dale gave it to me, Your Grace," Scarlett said, walking forward because stopping felt more dangerous than moving forward ever could. "I did not choose it to remind you of anything. If it causes you pain, I am truly sorry for that." She crossed the room with her back straight and her chin level, aware of every eye following her, aware of the portrait of Sophia hanging in the next room that made the resemblance somehow sharper. Though Scarlett's face was entirely her own and looked nothing like the woman in the painting except in the way she held herself, upright and unhurried, refusing to be rushed by anyone staring. Nathan asked her, quietly, once she had reached her seat, where exactly she had gotten it, and Scarlett told him the plain truth without embellishment, because embellishment had never once served her well in her life, and she saw no reason to begin trying it that night. The joke that had been planned for the evening died somewhere between the door and the table, replaced by an unease none of the guests were prepared to feel, and that none of them could quite name aloud. Mr. Bethany, to his own visible discomfort, found himself with nothing clever left to say, and spent the first course studying his soup with far more interest than soup generally deserved. Wyatt, who had spent the whole week composing witty remarks for the occasion, discovered every one of them had gone dry in his throat, and settled for passing the bread instead, which Jasmine considered, privately, the wisest thing she had ever seen him do. By the second course, a strange and unexpected thing began to happen. A guest asked Scarlett, half out of curiosity and half simply because the silence needed filling, what she thought of a recent rise in grain prices, expecting a shrug or a blush in answer. Scarlett answered clearly, with figures, with reasons, and the guest blinked twice before asking a second question, and then a third, and by the time the dessert arrived the table had, without quite meaning to, stopped treating the evening as a joke and started treating it, cautiously, as a conversation. Later that night, long after the guests had retired still murmuring about what they had witnessed, Nathan found Scarlett in the corridor outside the library, still dressed in the burgundy silk because no one had thought, in the confusion of the evening, to tell her she was permitted to change. "You said something to Mrs. Dale about the stitching before dinner," he said. It was not a question, and Scarlett understood that some part of him had been turning that detail over all evening, unable to let it go. "There is something sewn into the lining, Your Grace," she said, deciding, as she had decided years ago, that honesty was always the shorter and safer road, even when it was the more frightening one to walk. "I did not want to mention it in front of your guests." He led her into the small sitting room where a single lamp still burned low, and there, with Mrs. Dale standing close and unusually quiet, Scarlett worked her fingers along the seam until a fold of fabric gave way beneath her touch, revealing a narrow pocket sewn with a hand far too careful to be accidental. Inside was a folded note in handwriting Nathan recognized before he had even finished unfolding it, and beneath the note, a second page covered in careful columns of numbers. "That is her hand," he said, his voice cracking open in a way it had not done in 2 years, not once, not even at her funeral, when he had stood dry-eyed and stone-faced because falling apart in front of an entire county had felt like the last thing he owed her. Scarlett studied the numbers and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her because she recognized the pattern immediately. The same round, careless amounts she had been quietly copying into her own notebook for weeks without ever knowing whose hand had first noticed them. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I believe I have seen these exact payments before. I believe your wife was trying to tell someone the very thing I have been trying to say myself, and no one was listening to either of us." Nathan sat down slowly, the note still in his hand, and for a long while he did not speak. "She never told me she was worried about the accounts," he said finally. "She told me everything, or so I believed. I have spent 2 years thinking I knew every part of her, and tonight I am learning I did not know this part at all. Perhaps she meant to tell you," Scarlett offered gently, "and simply ran out of time before she could. That is not the same as being kept from you on purpose." He looked up at her, something raw and grateful in his expression. "You did not have to say that." "No," Scarlett agreed. But it happens to be true, and I find the true thing is usually kinder than we expect it to be, if we give it the chance. They spread both records across the desk that night, Sophia's hidden page beside Scarlett's small worn notebook, and watched the same names and numbers rise up from two different hands, written 2 years apart, as though the dead woman and the living maid had somehow been keeping the same quiet vigil without ever meeting. Mr. Andrew was sent for despite the late hour and studied the pages with the same steady patience he brought to every task in his long career, cross-checking dates against the old delivery ledgers he kept, out of habit, in the estate office. These purchases were never delivered in full, he said, running a finger down a column. I marked several of them wrong myself, years ago, and never once thought to question why the numbers never quite matched. Mrs. John, an older maid who rarely spoke unless she was entirely certain of what she meant to say, was found still awake in the kitchen and asked gently what she remembered from those years. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron before answering, the way she did when a question required more honesty than comfort. There were carts that came late at night and left again before the staff woke, she said. I told myself, at the time, that it was none of my business. I have wondered since whether that was ever the right thing to tell myself. Mrs. Dale, listening from near the doorway, added her own memory to the growing pile of evidence. I recall a season when the roof repairs were billed twice over, she said slowly, and I was told the first bill had been an error, corrected without charge. I never saw proof of that correction. I simply believed it, because believing it was easier than asking further questions of a man I had known since he was a boy. None of us asked further questions, Mr. Andrews said. That is, I think, exactly how a thing like this survives as long as it does. Not through cleverness. Through everyone deciding, separately, that it was not their place to look too closely. Nathan sat with his hands pressed together, watching a woman he had, until 3 days earlier, barely looked at directly, hold together a truth that had eluded him and every person in his employ for 2 long years. You found what I could not bear to look for, he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. You did not look because it would have hurt too much to find, Scarlett answered, not unkindly. I looked because I could not stop myself from looking. Neither of those is a failing in a person, Your Grace. But now we both know, and neither of us can pretend not to any longer. One name, appearing on both lists in 2 different hands, belonged to someone who had sat at that very dinner table 2 nights before, and Nathan's face went very still when Scarlett pointed to it. I have known him my whole life, he said quietly. He carried my father's coffin. I do not know how to hold both of those facts at once. You will not have to hold them forever, Scarlett said. Only long enough to be certain, and then the holding becomes his to do, not yours. They worked through the night comparing every remaining record they could find, and somewhere near dawn, with the candle burned low and Mrs. Dale dozing gently in the armchair by the fire, Nathan looked across the desk at Scarlett and said, quietly, 2 years ago, I would have told you grief was the heaviest thing a person could carry. I am no longer certain that is true. I think perhaps silence is heavier still, and I have been carrying a great deal of it without ever calling it by its proper name. Then let us stop carrying it alone, Scarlett said, and did not pull her hand away when his fingers found hers across the scattered pages. Word travels through a great house faster than anyone intends it to, and by the end of the following week, Scarlett understood that something inside Hollingbourne had noticed her noticing. She returned to her small room above the laundry one evening to find her few belongings disturbed, her drawer left open at an angle she never left it, and beneath her bed, the loose floorboard pressed back down carelessly rather than in the careful way she always set it, her notebook still there, but only just. She said nothing to anyone that night, only lay awake with her heart working harder than the quiet of the room should have required, and made a decision that felt both frightening and entirely her own to make. She would not stop. The following morning, rumors began moving through the house, and, soon after, through the wider circle of guests who had witnessed the dinner and could not resist repeating what they had seen. Scarlett had bewitched the Duke, some whispered. She had worn the dead wife's gown on purpose, to draw his eye and secure her own future. She was clever with numbers, others said, because clever women always had something to hide behind their cleverness. Nathan heard the whispers over breakfast, carried to him secondhand by a footman who did not enjoy repeating them, and felt something return to him that he had not felt in 2 years. Not the tired, distant grief he had grown used to, but a sharp, protective heat that surprised him with its own intensity. He found Scarlett in the corridor near the library and said, plainly, in front of two guests who happened to be passing at that exact moment, "Anyone who repeats that rumor within these walls again may explain themselves to me directly." Scarlett appreciated it more than she allowed herself to show. But later, alone with him in the library, she said quietly, "I do not want your protection to be the reason people stop laughing at me, Your Grace. I want the truth to be the reason. Protection fades the moment you are not in the room. Truth does not." He looked at her a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that neither of them had a polite name for yet. "Then we will give them the truth," he said. "But I would still rather no one spoke to you the way they have been speaking, truth or no truth." There was a warmth in the way he said it that neither of them acknowledged aloud, though both of them noticed it clearly, and neither one moved away from the other as quickly as the moment required. For a moment his hand found hers, briefly, only briefly, and then Mr. Andrew's footsteps sounded in the hall, and they stepped apart, though the memory of it stayed with both of them the whole evening through. The investigation deepened through the following weeks in quiet evenings spent in the study, ledgers spread across the desk between them, Nathan's shoulder occasionally close enough to Scarlett's that neither of them pulled away as quickly as etiquette technically required. Somewhere in those long nights of columns and candlelight, something between them shifted from careful respect into something warmer, something that made Mrs. Dale exchange a knowing look with Mr. Andrew whenever she carried in the evening tea and found the two of them laughing quietly over some shared joke about a particularly stubborn set of figures. "You are not what I expected a maid to be," Nathan told her one evening, watching her cross out a column of figures with the same quiet focus her father must have once taught her at their own kitchen table. "You are not what I expected a duke to be either," she answered without looking up, and he laughed, a real laugh, loud and unguarded. The first Mrs. Dale had heard from him in 2 years, loud enough that it carried down the hallway and made the older woman stop where she stood and press a hand to her own chest with quiet, private relief. "I used to be better company than this," he admitted later, more seriously, watching the fire rather than her. "Before. I do not always remember how to be anymore." "You are better company than you think," Scarlett said. "You simply forgot that being quiet is not the same thing as being empty. I have watched you long enough to know the difference, Your Grace, even when you did not." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the fire cracking softly in the silence between them. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering a moment longer than the gesture strictly required, and something passed across his face that was not grief, and was not simply gratitude either, something closer to the beginning of hope, fragile and unfamiliar after 2 years without it. "Scarlett," he said quietly, I think of very little else these days besides the evenings I spend in this room with you." "That is a dangerous thing for a duke to admit to a maid," she said softly, though she did not step back. "Then it is fortunate," he said, "that I have stopped caring very much what is or is not appropriate to admit." But the closer the two of them came to the full truth, the more dangerous the ground beneath them became. A note arrived for Scarlett one evening, slipped beneath her door without a name attached, warning her plainly to abandon whatever she believed she was uncovering, and reminding her, in careful, unhurried handwriting, that a maid's position in a great house could be ended with a single word from the right person. She did not show it to Nathan immediately, afraid he would lock her away from the investigation entirely to keep her safe from whoever had written it, and that small, private fear turned out to be the mistake that very nearly cost her everything. If a story like this one keeps you watching until the very last minute, that is exactly why I keep making them. Subscribe if you have not already, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every message myself, and I would genuinely love the chance to say hello back to you. 3 nights after the warning arrived, a note left in handwriting deliberately forged to resemble Scarlett's own drew her out to the old boathouse at the edge of the estate grounds, on the pretense of meeting Mrs. Dale about a private matter that could not wait until morning. A storm rolled in from the coast while she waited alone inside, rain hammering the wooden roof, and by the time she understood that no one was coming to meet her, the door had already been latched quietly from the outside. Inside, by the dim light of a single lamp someone had left burning, the last of the household's remaining true ledgers had already been gathered in a careless pile, ready to be burned, and Scarlett had arrived early enough, by pure chance, to hide herself behind the old boat racks the moment she heard footsteps that were not Mrs. Dale's familiar, unhurried walk. She watched from the shadows, her heart working painfully hard, memorizing every page she could make out before the flame reached the paper. Names, dates, the same careless round numbers she had known by heart for weeks now, until the sound of the door being forced open from outside sent the intruder running out into the storm and the dark before their face was ever fully revealed. Nathan burst through the doorway moments later, soaked through from the rain, his voice raw with something that was no longer distance and no longer grief, but plain, unguarded fear. "Scarlett," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her name without a title standing in front of it like a wall between them. "I am here," she said, stepping out from behind the boats, smoke still curling faintly from the half-burned pages scattered across the floor. "And I already know most of what they tried to destroy tonight." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her by the shoulders, checking her over for injury with hands that were not entirely steady themselves. "What will you do with what you know?" he asked, his voice barely above the sound of the rain still hammering the roof. "We are going to let everyone see it," she answered, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further, standing close enough in the lamplight that the space between them had, without either of them quite deciding it, disappeared entirely, until he leaned down and kissed her once, gently, as though he had been waiting far longer than either of them had realized to finally do it. "I should apologize for that," he said afterward, though he did not look sorry at all. "You should not," Scarlett said, "and if you do it again, I will not stop you a second time either." He walked her back to the main house through the last of the storm, his coat wrapped around her shoulders against the cold, and neither of them spoke much on the way, though his hand found hers somewhere in the dark and did not let go until they reached the kitchen door, where Mrs. Dale was already waiting with a lamp and a blanket and an expression that suggested she had guessed at more of the evening's events than either of them had told her. "Sit," Mrs. Dale ordered, in the tone she had once used on Nathan as a boy sneaking in from the stables after curfew, and neither the Duke nor his future Duchess dared argue with her. She wrapped Scarlett in the blanket herself, muttering under her breath about storms and boathouses and young people who could not be trusted to stay indoors where it was sensible, though her hands, checking Scarlett over for injury, were far gentler than her words. Nora appeared moments later with hot tea she had clearly prepared the instant she heard the commotion, and hovered anxiously until Scarlett assured her, laughing despite the late hour, that she was entirely unharmed and did not need watching over quite so closely. "I told you this house needed watching," Mrs. John said from the doorway, arms folded, though there was real relief beneath the dry humor in her voice. "I did not expect to be right quite so literally." Nathan called every relevant member of the household, along with the same circle of guests who had once gathered to laugh at Scarlett, back to the same dining room where the joke had first begun 3 weeks earlier. Scarlett stood at the head of the table this time rather than at its edge, and laid out the evidence in the plain, clear language her father had once used to teach her arithmetic at their own small kitchen table. Payment by payment, delivery by delivery, 2 years of quiet theft drawn steadily from a dead woman's charitable fund meant for struggling families, and the village school Sophia had once quietly supported without ever asking for thanks. Mrs. John confirmed the late carts she remembered from those years. Mr. Andrew laid the estate's true delivery records beside the falsified ones for every guest to compare with their own eyes. Mr. Bethany, still clinging to some of his old habit of underestimating her, tried once more to dismiss the evidence as the invention of an ambitious young woman reaching above her station, until Scarlett produced the folded note from inside Sophia's gown and read the late Duchess's own handwriting aloud, naming the very suspicions she herself had died still trying to prove true. The man responsible for the theft. A distant relation who had managed portions of the estate's charitable accounts for years, trusted because he was family and never questioned because questioning family had always felt disloyal, went pale as the pieces locked together in front of everyone seated at that table. He tried, briefly and unconvincingly, to argue his own innocence. Then, seeing the certainty settle over every face around him, said nothing further at all, and left the room under the quiet escort of 2 footmen while the rest of the table sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Nathan stood then, and the room quieted the way it had quieted the night Scarlett first walked through the door in burgundy silk. This woman found what all of us, myself included, failed to find in 2 full years, he said, his voice steady enough that it carried to every corner of the room without effort. I let my own grief become an excuse not to look closely at anything that reminded me of my wife. That excuse cost this estate, and the people who depend on it, a great deal. It very nearly cost far more than money. He turned to Scarlett, and something in his expression softened even as his voice remained clear and certain. I do not see a maid standing at this table, he said. I see the only person in this house who never once stopped looking for the truth, even when it would have been far easier for her to stop. And I cannot imagine building whatever comes next without her standing beside me. Mr. Bethany, to his own credit, was the first to lower his eyes and offer something close to an honest apology. It was not eloquent, but it was sincere, and Scarlett accepted it with more grace than his earlier joke had ever deserved. Wyatt, red to the ears, mumbled an apology of his own a moment later, and Jasmine, who had never joined in the mockery to begin with, simply smiled at Scarlett across the table, a small, warm gesture that said more than any formal apology could have. I believe, Mr. Bethany added, clearing his throat in the manner of a man attempting humor to cover his own discomfort, that I owe the lady an apology and, quite possibly, a great deal of gratitude, since it appears her little book has saved this household a fortune I was too foolish to notice going missing in the first place. An audit of character, was it not? Scarlett said, a small, deliberate smile at the corner of her mouth. I believe we have all just received one. The table, to its own surprise, laughed, not at her this time, but with her, and even Mr. Bethany managed a rueful chuckle at his own expense, which Mrs. Dale later called the first genuinely humble sound she had ever heard leave the man's mouth in 30 years of acquaintance. Justice, when it finally came for the man responsible, was thorough rather than dramatic. He was removed from every position of trust he held, the stolen funds traced and recovered as far as the law allowed, and the entire matter handed over to the proper authorities rather than quietly buried to protect a family name, because Nathan insisted that the families who had gone without support for 2 years deserved to see the truth made public rather than hidden away a second time. The guests who had once mocked Scarlett found their own small reputations quietly reshaped by the story that spread afterward through the county. Not the story they had tried to tell about a scheming maid, but the true one, about a young woman with a gift for numbers who had uncovered what an entire household, guests included, had somehow managed to overlook. Lady Sowerby, whose sharp tongue had first inspired the original joke, found herself notably absent from the next several invitations sent out from Hollingbourne, a small, quiet consequence that spoke far louder than any argument ever could have. Mrs. Dale received, at last, an honest and heartfelt thank you from the Duke for a decision she had made almost blindly, trusting an instinct she had never fully been able to explain even to herself. Mr. Andrew was given greater authority over the estate's accounts going forward, the trust he had quietly earned over decades finally spoken aloud instead of simply assumed. Mrs. John, who had spent years believing her own silence was simply good sense, was told plainly and warmly by Nathan that her honesty, however late in coming, had mattered more than she would ever fully know. Noah, the young footman, was given a modest raise in wages and a great deal of good-natured teasing from the kitchen staff about owing Scarlett a lifetime supply of biscuits, which he cheerfully agreed to. And Scarlett Greenwood, who had once stood at the edge of candlelight handing round the second course while an entire table decided in advance that she was not worth their attention, was offered something no one in that house had ever once offered a maid before. Full oversight of the estate's restored charitable accounts, a position built entirely on what her mind could do rather than what her uniform said she was permitted to be. Nathan asked her the question that mattered most on a quiet evening in the garden Sophia had once loved, now slowly being brought back to careful life under Scarlett's own patient attention, with no guests watching and no title left standing between them. "I am not asking the Duchess of Hollingbourne to marry me," he said, taking both her hands in his own beneath the roses. "I am asking Scarlett Greenwood, because that is who I have fallen in love with." In a library, over ledgers, inside a burning boathouse, and every ordinary evening in between those larger moments. Scarlett looked at him a long moment, feeling the full weight of everything the past weeks had cost her and given her in equal, careful measure. "Then hear my one condition," she said. "I will marry you because I love you, Nathan Kahn, not because a title is being offered to me alongside it. If that reason is not enough for you, then it should not be enough for me either." "It is more than enough," he said, and kissed her there among Sophia's roses, in a quiet neither of them needed to fill with anything more, his hand warm against her cheek, hers resting over his heart as though she could feel, through his coat, that it had finally, fully, come back to life. Their wedding, when it came, was small and warm rather than grand. The people who had genuinely stood by them filling the chapel rather than the wider crowd who had once come only to be entertained at another person's expense. Mrs. Dale cried through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward to anyone who dared mention it. Mr. Andrew, uncharacteristically, smiled the whole way through without once trying to hide it. Mrs. John sat near the front in a new dress Scarlett had quietly insisted on gifting her, looking prouder than she would ever admit aloud to a single soul. Nora cried openly and without any shame at all, and Leo, standing near the back beside his sister Kira, whispered that he had never once doubted how the story would end, which was, everyone agreed afterward, a fairly generous rewriting of his earlier opinion. Months later, the same dining room that had once gone silent in shock welcomed Scarlett through its doors a second time, not as a maid summoned for entertainment, but as the Duchess of Hollingbourne, on the evening of the estate's first charitable dinner held openly in Sophia's honor, the funds finally restored and finally reaching the families and the small village school they were always meant to serve. The room went quiet again as she entered, but this time the silence carried something entirely different inside it: respect, warmth, and, for at least two of the guests present, a quiet, private discomfort they had each earned honestly over the past months and had no one to blame for but themselves. Nathan took her hand in front of everyone gathered there, the way he had once been far too guarded to do for anyone at all, and Scarlett smiled, not because the gown she wore that evening was beautiful, though it certainly was, but because she understood something now that she had always known quietly, even back at the edge of candlelight with a serving tray balanced carefully in her hands. The dress had never made her matter. She had mattered long before anyone in that room had ever bothered to notice. A person's worth was never decided by the uniform they wore or the title written in front of their name. It lived instead in what they noticed, what they refused to look away from, and what they kept doing quietly even when no one was watching or offering them any credit for it at all. Truth, when someone has the patience and the courage to keep gathering it honestly, tends to outlast every joke ever made at its expense. That is where this story ends, though for Scarlett and Nathan, it was only ever the beginning of everything that came after. I wanted this one to matter a little more than most, because somewhere out there tonight, someone watching has felt exactly the way Scarlett did at that first dinner table. Talented, overlooked, and quietly certain of their own worth long before anyone else in the room ever caught up to it. If that happens to be you tonight, I hope you carry this story with you the next time someone decides to underestimate you. If you stayed until this very line, thank you, sincerely, for giving this story your time tonight. Comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is right now where you are. I read every single comment myself, and I would truly love the chance to say hello back to you personally. And if stories like this one are worth your time, consider subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it tells me to keep writing more of them. For you, one story at a time.